This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
In the year 1325, and sought a precarious subsistence from fishing, and from the wild fowl which frequented the waters, as well as from the cultivation of such simple vegetables as they could raise on their floating gardens. The place was called Tenochtitlan, though only known to Europeans by its other name of Mexico, derived from their war god Mexitli. They established a reputation for courage as well as cruelty in war, which made their name terrible throughout the valley. Then was formed that remarkable league which indeed has no parallel in history. It was agreed between the states of Mexico, Tezcuco, and the neighboring little kingdom of Tlacopan that they should mutually support each other in their wars, offensive and defensive. What is more extraordinary than the treaty itself, however, is the fidelity with which it was maintained. The Allies, by the middle of the 15th century, under the first Montezuma, had spread down the sides of the tableland to the borders of the Gulf of Mexico. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, gave evidence of the public prosperity. Its frail tenements were supplanted by solid structures of stone and lime. Its population rapidly increased. No state was able long to resist the accumulated strength of the Confederates. At the beginning of the 16th century, just before the arrival of the Spaniard, the Aztec dominion reached across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The Aztecs' and Tezcucans' form of government was monarchical and nearly absolute. The government was an elective monarchy. The sovereign was selected from the brothers of the deceased prince, or, in default of them, from his nephews. The candidate preferred must have distinguished himself in war, though, as in the case of the last Montezuma, he were a member of the priesthood. The new monarch was installed in his regal dignity with much parade of religious ceremony, but not until, by a victorious campaign, he had obtained a sufficient number of captives to grace his triumphal entry into the capital, and to furnish victims for the dark and bloody rites which stained the Aztec superstition. Their spacious palaces were provided with halls for the different councils, who aided the monarch in the transaction of business. It is certain there was a distinct class of nobles, with large landed possessions, who held the most important offices near the person of the prince, and engrossed the administration of the provinces and cities. The legislative power, both in Mexico and Tezcuco, resided wholly with the monarch. Over each of the principal cities, with its dependent territories, was placed a supreme judge, appointed by the crown, with original and final jurisdiction in both civil and criminal cases. The Aztecs were sufficiently civilized to evince a solicitude for the rights both of property and of persons. The proceedings in the courts were conducted with decency and order. No counsel was employed. The parties stated their own case and supported it by their witnesses. The statement of the case, the testimony, and the proceedings of the trial were all set forth by a clerk in hieroglyphical paintings and handed over to the court. A capital sentence was indicated by a line traced with an arrow across the portrait of the accused. The rites of marriage were celebrated with as much formality as in any Christian country, and the institution was held in such reverence that a tribunal was instituted for the sole purpose of determining questions relating to it. Divorces could not be obtained until authorized by a sentence of this court, after a patient hearing of the parties. The royal revenues derived from various sources. In addition to a tax on all the agricultural produce of the kingdom, there was another on its manufactures. The nature and the variety of the tributes will be best shown by an enumeration of some of the principal articles. These were cotton dresses and mantles of featherwork, exquisitely made, ornamented armor, vases and plates of gold, gold dust, bands and bracelets, crystal, gilt, and varnished jars and goblets, bells, arms, and utensils of copper, reams of paper, grain, fruits, copal, amber, cochineal, cocoa, wild animals and birds, timber, lime, mats, etc. The tributes became so burdensome by the close of the dynasty, being rendered still more oppressive by the manner of collection, that they bred disaffection throughout the land, and prepared the way for its conquest by the Spaniards. But the great aim of the Aztec institutions, to which private discipline and public honors were alike directed, was the profession of arms. In Mexico, as in Egypt, the soldier shared with the priest the highest consideration. The king, as we have seen, must be an experienced warrior. The tutelary deity of the Aztecs was the god of war. The dress of the higher warriors was picturesque and often magnificent. Their bodies were covered with a close vest of quilted cotton, so thick as to be impenetrable to the light missiles of Indian warfare. This garment was so light and serviceable that it was adopted by the Spaniards. The wealthier chiefs sometimes wore, instead of this cotton mail, a cuirass made of thin plates of gold or silver. Their helmets were fashioned like the heads of wild animals, and sometimes made of silver, on top of which waved a panache of variegated feathers, sprinkled with precious stones and ornaments of gold. In contemplating the religious system of the Aztecs, one is struck with its apparent incongruity, as if some portion of it had emanated from a comparatively refined people, open to gentle influences, while the rest breathes a spirit of unmitigated ferocity. The Aztecs recognized the existence of a supreme creator and lord of the universe. They addressed him in their prayers as the God by whom we live, omnipresent, that knoweth all thoughts and giveth all gifts, invisible, incorporeal, one God of perfect perfection and purity. But the idea of unity, of a being who has no need of inferior ministers to execute his purposes, was too simple or too vast for their understandings, and they sought relief in the plurality of deities, who presided over the elements, the changes of the seasons, and the various occupations of man. Of these, there were 13 principal deities, and more than 200 inferior, to each of whom some special day or appropriate festival was consecrated. At the head of all stood the terrible Huitzilopochtli, the Mexican Mars. This was the patron deity of the nation. His altars reeked with the blood of human sacrifice in every city of the empire. A far more interesting personage in their mythology was Quetzalcoatl. His name means bird-serpent, god of the air, a divinity who during his residence on earth instructed the natives in the use of metals, in agriculture, and in the arts of government. Under him, the earth teemed with fruits and flowers, without the pains of culture. In short, these were the halcyon days. It was the golden age of Anahuac. From some cause, not explained, Quetzalcoatl incurred the wrath of one of the principal gods, and was compelled to abandon the country. He took leave of his followers, promising that he and his descendants would revisit them hereafter. He was said to have been tall in stature, with a white skin, long dark hair, and a flowing beard. The Mexicans, or Aztecs, looked confidently to the return of the benevolent deity, and this remarkable tradition, deeply cherished in their hearts, prepared the way, as we shall see hereafter, for the future success of the Spaniards. The influence of the priesthood must be greatest in an imperfect state of civilization, where it engrosses all the scanty science of the time in its own body, such as the sciences of astrology and divination, in which the Aztec priests were well initiated. They impressed the ignorant people with sentiments of superstitious awe. 5,000 priests were, in some way or other, attached to the principal temple in the capital. At the head of the whole establishment were 2 high priests, elected from the order, as it would seem, by the king and principal nobles, without reference to birth, but solely for their qualifications. They were equal in dignity, and inferior only to the sovereign, who rarely acted without their advice in weighty matters of public concern. The Mexican temples, the teocolis, houses of God as they were called, were very numerous. There were several hundreds in each of the principal cities. They were